The first time Admiral Yamato Kenji heard the American ships had sailed past Truk without firing a single shot, he thought his radio man had made an error. Standing in the humid command bunker on Rabaul, sweat beading beneath his crisp white uniform despite the underground coolness, he stared at the crackling radio as if willing it to correct itself. The message came again, static-filled but unmistakable. American fleet observed heading northwest. No engagement at Truk. Repeat. No engagement. Kenji's weathered hands, which had once guided destroyers to the narrow straits of his homeland, trembled slightly as he reached for his teacup. The porcelain was delicate, painted with cherry blossoms, a gift from his wife Akiko before he departed for what they'd both believed would be a glorious, swift campaign. That had been 18 months ago. The tea had long since grown cold, but he sipped it anyway, the bitter liquid matching the taste that had settled in his mouth since the Americans began their inexplicable strategy. Behind him, Lieutenant Commander Sato shuffled through reconnaissance photographs, his young face creased with confusion that mirrored Kenji's own bewilderment. "Sir," Sato said, his voice carrying the careful deference that younger officers had perfected, "our intelligence confirms the Americans have sufficient firepower to reduce Truk to rubble. Their bomber formations alone could—" "Then why don't they?" Kenji's question cut through the underground chamber like a blade through silk. The bunker fell silent except for the distant hum of generators and the occasional crackle of radio static. Maps covered every surface, marked with red pins showing Japanese strongholds and black pins tracking American movements. The pattern that emerged made no sense according to any military doctrine Kenji had studied at the Naval War College, any strategy outlined in the classic texts he'd memorized as a midshipman. Colonel Tanaka, the Army liaison whose presence always made the confined space feel even smaller, leaned forward from his position near the communication equipment. His khaki uniform was perpetually wrinkled, and his thick glasses reflected the bunker's harsh electric lights. "Perhaps," he offered carefully, "they lacked the stomach for direct confrontation. Americans prefer easy victories." But even as Tanaka spoke the words, none of the three men believed them. They had all witnessed American determination at Guadalcanal, seen the ferocity with which Marine units fought for every yard of contested ground. These were not warriors who shied away from battle. The radio crackled again, bringing reports from other bypassed fortifications. Woji Atoll, untouched. Mille, ignored. Malaleup, sailed past without acknowledgement. Each report felt like another piece of a puzzle whose picture remained frustratingly obscure. Kenji had spent his entire career preparing for the decisive battle that would break American resolve, the moment when superior Japanese fighting spirit would triumph over American industrial might. Instead, the Americans seemed to be playing an entirely different game. Outside the bunker, Rabaul's massive fortifications stretched across the landscape like concrete manifestations of Japanese determination. Thousands of workers had labored for months to create this fortress, carving gun emplacements from volcanic rock, building underground facilities that could withstand prolonged bombardment. The harbor bristled with coastal defense guns capable of sinking any ship that dared approach. Supply depots held enough ammunition and food to sustain a siege lasting years. Every aspect of the base had been designed according to traditional military thinking. Make yourself too strong to ignore, too costly to take. Yet as Kenji walked through the tunnels that evening, past rooms filled with artillery shells that might never be fired, he couldn't shake the growing suspicion that strength itself had somehow become irrelevant. The Americans weren't following the script. They weren't playing by rules that had governed warfare for centuries. In his private quarters, a small concrete cell barely large enough for a cot, desk, and the small shrine where he honored his ancestors, Kenji opened the leather-bound journal where he recorded his thoughts each night. The pages chronicled his growing bewilderment. Early entries had been confident, filled with tactical analyses and predictions of American failure. Recent pages revealed a mind grappling with concepts that challenged everything he'd been taught to believe about warfare and honor. He wrote by lamplight, his brush moving with practiced strokes across rice paper. The enemy shows us neither the respect of engagement nor the courtesy of explanation. They treat our strongest positions as if they were empty ocean. Is this genius or madness? And if it is genius, what does that make us, the ones who cannot understand it? The question that haunted Kenji, the one he couldn't write even in his private journal, was simpler and more terrible. What if the Americans were right? Each morning, Admiral Kenji performed the same ritual that had anchored his life for the past 43 years. He rose before dawn, washed his face with water warmed by the bunker's heating system, and spent precisely 15 minutes in meditation before his family shrine. The small altar held photographs of his father and grandfather, both naval officers who had died serving the emperor, alongside a piece of jade his wife had pressed into his hands the morning he departed for what they'd both believed would be a glorious, swift campaign. The routine provided structure in a world that seemed increasingly without logic. After meditation came inspection of the overnight dispatches, then a walk through the bunker's main corridors to assess the morale of his staff. These walks had become exercises in careful observation. He noted which officers met his eyes directly and which found sudden interest in their paperwork. He listened to the cadence of conversations that stopped too abruptly when he approached, watched for the telltale signs of men beginning to doubt not just their mission, but their commander's ability to comprehend what they faced. Lieutenant Commander Sato had begun displaying nervous habits, constantly adjusting his glasses, tapping his fingers against his thigh in complex rhythms that seemed to follow no pattern Kenji could discern. During morning briefings, the young officer would present intelligent reports with the mechanical precision of someone who no longer believed the information held meaning. American carrier formations observed 200 nautical miles southeast of Palau, he would announce, in the same tone he might use to report the weather. Course and speed suggest continuation of northwestern advance, bypassing all prepared defensive positions. The reports had become a litany of irrelevance. Every strengthened position, every carefully prepared killing field, every tactical advantage the Japanese had spent months creating, all ignored by an enemy who seemed to view the Pacific not as a series of fortress islands, but as empty highway stretches to be traveled at will. Kenji found himself thinking often of his childhood in Hiroshima, where his grandfather had taught him Go on summer evenings while cicadas sang in the garden. "Control the center," the old man had repeated, moving black stones with fingers gnarled by decades of naval service. "Force your opponent to react to your moves, not the reverse." It had been a lesson about the game and life itself. Yet here in the Pacific, the Americans had somehow convinced the Japanese to place their stones exactly where the Americans wanted them, and then revealed that the game board was larger than anyone had imagined. The psychological weight of irrelevance pressed down on the garrison like the humid air that never quite left the bunker's corridors. Men who had trained their entire careers for the moment when they would stand against invasion found themselves manning guns that never fired, operating radars that tracked ships heading elsewhere, maintaining ammunition stores that accumulated dust in the tropical heat. The very strength they had built had become their prison. Colonel Tanaka had developed his own coping mechanism, obsessive planning for battles that would never come. His office overflowed with defensive schemes, detailed maps showing optimal firing positions, calculated fields of fire that would destroy any landing force foolish enough to attempt an assault. He worked on these plans with the devotion of a monk copying sacred texts, as if the act of preparation itself could summon the confrontation that would validate their presence. "The Americans must eventually realize they cannot simply ignore us," Tanaka insisted during one of their evening discussions. The three senior officers had formed a habit of gathering after the day's reports were completed, sharing whatever alcohol remained from their personal supplies while debating their situation. Supply lines become vulnerable when stretched too thin. They'll need secure bases eventually. But even Tanaka's voice carried less conviction with each passing week. Intelligence reports showed American forces establishing new airfields on captured atolls, creating supply chains that didn't require the great fortresses Japan had spent so much effort constructing. The Americans were writing new rules for Pacific warfare, rules that rendered traditional thinking obsolete. Kenji's private torment went deeper than professional frustration. He had built his identity around concepts of honor that demanded facing one's enemies directly, meeting strength with strength, proving worth through courage in battle. The American strategy offered none of these satisfactions. There was no honor in being ignored, no courage required to maintain defenses that would never be tested. His father's sword, which hung in his quarters as a reminder of generations of warrior tradition, seemed to mock him with its unused perfection. The letters he wrote to his wife Akiko became exercises in careful omission. He could not tell her that he commanded a fortress that might as well have been built on the moon for all the strategic importance it held. He could not explain that the enemy showed them neither the respect of hatred nor the acknowledgement of fear. Instead, he wrote of daily routines, of the health of his officers, of his hopes for swift resolution to the conflict. The lies tasted bitter on his tongue as even as he formed them with his brush. Sleep came fitfully in the concrete chambers that never quite felt like rest. Kenji would wake in the hours before dawn, his mind filled with dreams of battles that never occurred, of American ships that sailed past his strongest defenses as if they were invisible. In these dreams, he sometimes found himself screaming orders to guns that fired at empty ocean, commanding troops who could not see the enemy they were meant to fight. The most disturbing moments came when he caught himself hoping for attack. The idea shamed him. Hoping for battle meant hoping for the deaths of men under his command, but the alternative seemed worse. To be bypassed was to become irrelevant, and irrelevance felt like a form of death that offered none of death's honor. One morning, while reviewing reconnaissance photographs that showed yet another American fleet heading toward yet another objective that wasn't Rabaul, Kenji found himself wondering if this was how empires died. Not in glorious last stands or heroic sacrifices, but in the slow realization that the world had moved beyond the assumptions on which they had built their strength. The morning Admiral Kenji learned that Kwajalein had fallen in just 4 days, he stood so abruptly that his teacup shattered against the concrete floor of the command bunker. The porcelain fragments scattered across maps of the Marshall Islands, the delicate cherry blossoms painted on the shards seeming to bleed into the blue ink marking Japanese defensive positions. 4 days, he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. Lieutenant Commander Sato stood at rigid attention, the dispatch trembling slightly in his hands. Kwajalein was supposed to hold for months. The fortress the Japanese engineers had proclaimed impregnable, 30,000 tons of concrete, underground tunnels connecting every defensive position, coastal guns that could sink a battleship, had crumbled like sand before waves. But that wasn't the detail that made Kenji's chest tighten with dread. According to the intelligence reports, the Americans had bypassed 17 other fortified positions to reach Kwajalein, then moved on immediately after its capture, leaving minimal garrison forces behind. "Sir," Sato said carefully, "the pattern suggests they are not interested in holding territory for its own sake. They appear to be selecting only positions that serve specific strategic purposes." Colonel Tanaka, who had been maintaining stoic silence during the morning briefings for the past 3 weeks, finally spoke. "Which strategic purpose does Rabaul serve if they can simply go around us?" The question hung in the recycled air like incense smoke, bitter and persistent. Outside their underground fortress, construction crews continued reinforcing positions that seemed increasingly pointless. The sound of jackhammers and concrete mixers provided a constant backdrop to their growing understanding that they might be building monuments to obsolete thinking. Kenji walked to the situation map that dominated the bunker's main wall. Red pins marked Japanese strongholds across the Pacific, a constellation of fortresses that had once seemed like an impenetrable barrier. Black pins showed American advances, and their pattern revealed a strategy so audacious it bordered on the incomprehensible. The Americans weren't trying to break through Japanese defenses, they were treating the entire defensive line as irrelevant. "They're making us irrelevant," Kenji said, speaking the thought that had haunted him for weeks. "Not defeating us, not conquering us, simply ignoring us." The psychological impact rippled through the garrison like shockwaves from a distant explosion. Men who had volunteered for what they expected to be the war's decisive battle found themselves spectators to conflicts happening elsewhere. Radio operators monitored frequencies carrying reports of battles they would never join. Intelligence officers tracked enemy movements that had nothing to do with their position. Gunners maintained weapons that fired only test rounds into empty ocean. Major Hayashi, the base's chief engineering officer, had developed a nervous habit of calculating supply consumption rates with obsessive precision. During staff meetings, he would announce exactly how many days their ammunition would last at various combat intensities, how long their food stores could sustain the garrison, and how much fuel remained for the generators that powered their underground complex. The numbers provided an illusion of purpose, as if precise logistics could somehow summon the battle that would give meaning to their preparation. At current consumption rates, Hayashi announced during one particularly surreal briefing, "We can maintain full defensive readiness for 18 months without resupply. Our ammunition stores are sufficient for 3 weeks of sustained combat at maximum intensity." Against what enemy? The question came from Captain Nakamura, the base's youngest senior officer, whose frustration had been building like pressure in a sealed container. "The Americans sail past us as if we're a scenic landmark. We could have ammunition for 18 years and it wouldn't matter." The breach of protocol, questioning a superior officer's implied assumptions, would have resulted in severe punishment under normal circumstances. Instead, Kenji found himself nodding in agreement. Normal circumstances had ceased to exist the moment the Americans had demonstrated that strength and position meant nothing if your enemy refused to acknowledge them. Intelligence reports from bypassed garrisons painted pictures of surreal isolation. Thousands of Japanese troops maintained perfect defensive readiness on islands the Americans had designated irrelevant. They conducted training exercises, maintained equipment, and prepared for battles that would never come while the war moved past them like a tide flowing around rocks. The most devastating report came from Malalepa Atoll, where Commander Ishida had sent increasingly desperate radio messages requesting permission to abandon his position and somehow join the fighting elsewhere. His final transmission, before communications ceased entirely, had been both heartbreaking and terrifying. "We are ready to die for the Emperor, but the enemy will not give us the honor of death in battle. We have become ghosts watching a war we cannot join." Kenji understood the sentiment with painful clarity. Death in battle carried honor, meaning, purpose. Being bypassed carried none of these consolations. It was a kind of military purgatory where men maintained readiness for a test that would never come. The American strategy's psychological brilliance became clearer with each passing week. Traditional Japanese military thinking emphasized the spiritual power of dying for a cause, the honor found in sacrifice, and the way death in battle could transform defeat into victory through the example it set for others. By refusing to attack prepared positions, the Americans denied Japanese forces the opportunity for meaningful sacrifice. They forced proud warriors to confront the possibility that their deaths might accomplish nothing beyond reducing garrison strength by 1. Colonel Tanaka had begun drinking more heavily during their evening discussions, his normally precise speech slurring slightly as he worked through bottles of sake that he claimed were for ceremonial purposes. One night, as rain drummed against the bunker's ventilation grates, he voiced the fear that none of them wanted to acknowledge. "What if they never come?" he asked, staring into his cup as if it contained answers instead of rice wine. "What if we sit here for the entire war, maintaining perfect readiness for a battle that never happens? What if the war ends and we're still here, still waiting?" The possibilities seemed worse than defeat, worse than death, worse than any outcome they had prepared themselves to face. To be forgotten by history while it was being made, to become footnotes in a conflict they had trained their entire lives to join. The prospect carried a special kind of horror for men whose culture had taught them that meaning came through action, honor through engagement, worth through the willingness to sacrifice everything for a cause greater than themselves. Lieutenant Commander Sato had stopped maintaining his personal appearance with the same meticulous care that had marked his earlier service. His uniform, while still regulation, showed the subtle signs of a man who no longer expected inspection by superior officers who might matter. During intelligence briefings, he presented information with the mechanical efficiency of someone reading obituaries for strangers. American forces have established new air bases on Majuro and Kwajalein, he reported one morning. Bomber range now includes all Marshall Island positions. However, no bombing raids have been conducted against bypassed installations. The final sentence carried the weight of absurdity. The Americans possessed the capability to destroy them, but chose not to exercise it. They had rendered Rabaul strategically meaningless while leaving it operationally intact, a kind of military limbo that Japanese doctrine had never contemplated. Kenji's private journals from this period reflected his growing understanding that the Americans had achieved something unprecedented in warfare. They had made their enemy's strength irrelevant without defeating it. Every gun emplacement, every underground tunnel, every carefully positioned defensive obstacle remained perfectly functional and completely useless. The realization that strength itself could become meaningless challenged assumptions that went beyond military strategy. If overwhelming defensive capability couldn't ensure relevance, if perfect preparation couldn't guarantee participation, then what foundation existed for confidence in any endeavor? The Americans had somehow weaponized irrelevance, turned being ignored into a fate worse than destruction. The revelation came not through dramatic intelligence breakthrough or captured documents, but through a series of small observations that accumulated like drops of water eventually filling a basin. Admiral Kenji first glimpsed the pattern while studying shipping reports in the pre-dawn hours when the bunker felt most like a tomb. American shipping reports weren't just bypassing Japanese strongholds, they were creating an entirely new logistics network that treated the Pacific as a highway system rather than a series of contested territories. Each captured atoll became not a conquered fortress, but a service station, providing fuel, supplies, and airfield facilities for the next leap forward. The Americans weren't playing the territorial control game that Japanese strategy had been designed to counter. They were playing a mobility game that Japanese thinking hadn't even recognized as possible. "Look at the timing," Kenji said, spreading reconnaissance photographs across the briefing table like a fortune teller reading cards. Lieutenant Commander Sato and Colonel Tanaka leaned closer, studying images that showed American construction crews working with impossible efficiency on recently captured islands. Majuro falls on February 1st. By February 15th, they have a functional airfield. By March 1st, bomber squadrons are operating from that base to support the next advance. The photographs revealed construction techniques that Japanese engineers had never considered: prefabricated materials, modular equipment, standardized designs that could transform any suitable coral atoll into an operational base within weeks rather than months. Where Japanese fortress building emphasized permanence and maximum defensive strength, American base construction prioritized speed and functionality. Sato traced shipping routes on the map with his finger, following supply lines that formed an efficient network stretching back to American industrial centers. "They're not trying to hold every position forever," he said, his voice carrying the wonder of someone seeing a magic trick explained. "They only need each base long enough to support the next advance." The psychological impact of understanding hit the Japanese officers like a physical blow. They had spent months assuming American strategy was flawed because it didn't conform to Japanese expectations. The reality was far more disturbing. American strategy was succeeding precisely because it operated according to principles that Japanese military thinking hadn't incorporated. Colonel Tanaka poured himself a larger portion of sake than usual during their evening discussion. The alcohol had become necessary medicine for pride, wounded not by defeat, but by irrelevance. He said, "They've turned our strength into weakness." His words slightly slurred, but his thinking crystal clear. Every position we reinforce becomes another anchor tying us to the ocean floor while they sail wherever they choose. Intelligence reports from Tokyo revealed that the revelation was spreading throughout Japanese command structure like a virus, attacking assumptions rather than bodies. Admiral Yamamoto's staff had begun recommending wholesale revision of Pacific defense strategy, but the recommendations came too late. The strategic initiative had passed to an enemy who had never intended to fight the battle Japan had prepared for. The most devastating realization concerned resources. Every ton of concrete poured into fortress walls, every hour of labor spent digging defensive tunnels, every artillery piece positioned to cover landing beaches that would never be assaulted, all represented investments in irrelevance. Meanwhile, the Americans invested their resources in mobility, flexibility, and the ability to project power wherever they chose rather than wherever their enemies expected. Major Hayashi, whose obsession with supply calculations had become the butt of gentle jokes among the staff, suddenly found his expertise uncomfortably relevant. "If we calculate American resource allocation," he said during one briefing, spreading figures across his desk with the precision of an accountant auditing disaster, "they're spending perhaps 1/10 of what we are per unit of strategic effectiveness achieved." The numbers were stark and undeniable. American forces required minimal garrison strength for each captured position because they weren't trying to hold territory against determined attack. They needed only enough strength to maintain logistics functions and provide security for construction crews. Meanwhile, Japanese forces had to maintain full combat readiness at every position because they couldn't predict where the next American move would target. "We're playing defense against an opponent who has decided not to attack most of our defensive positions," Kenji observed, the irony bitter in his mouth. "We've achieved perfect readiness for battles they have no intention of fighting." Radio intercepts provided additional insight into American thinking. Unlike Japanese communications, which emphasized honor, sacrifice, and spiritual preparation for battle, American radio traffic focused on logistics, timing, and operational efficiency. Their commanders discussed supply schedules, construction deadlines, and fuel consumption rates with the same attention Japanese officers devoted to tactical doctrine and warrior spirit. The cultural gap was as significant as the strategic one. Japanese military thinking valued the spiritual dimension of warfare, the importance of morale, honor, and willingness to die for victory. American thinking, at least as revealed through their communications intercepts, treated war as an engineering problem to be solved through superior logistics and more efficient resource application. Captain Nakamura, whose frustration had made him the unofficial voice of the garrison's younger officers, summarized the revelation with painful clarity. "They've made us into museum exhibits. Perfect examples of outdated thinking, preserved in concrete and steel, maintained at enormous expense, completely irrelevant to the actual conflict." The comparison stung because of its accuracy. Rabaul had become a monument to military thinking that the Americans had simply bypassed rather than defeated. Every carefully planned defensive position, every expertly positioned gun emplacement, every tunnel and bunker represented outdated assumptions about how Pacific warfare would be conducted. Intelligence analysts began identifying patterns in American target selection that revealed sophisticated strategic thinking. They attacked only positions that served specific purposes in their advance toward Japan. Islands that could support air bases within range of the next objective, harbors deep enough for major fleet units, positions that commanded critical sea lanes or communication routes, Everything else, no matter how heavily fortified, was simply ignored. The realization that Japanese forces had concentrated their strength in positions the Americans had never intended to attack created a psychological crisis that went beyond military embarrassment. It suggested that Japanese leadership had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the conflict they were fighting. They had prepared for World War I-style territorial warfare, while the Americans were conducting something entirely new. "We've been playing the wrong game," Kenji wrote in his private journal during one of the sleepless nights that had become routine. "Not losing the right game, playing the wrong game entirely. The Americans understood something about modern warfare that we didn't even recognize existed." The revelation forced uncomfortable questions about Japanese military education, strategic thinking, and adaptability. How had American planners recognized possibilities that Japanese strategists had never considered? What assumptions about warfare had prevented Japanese commanders from developing similar approaches? And most disturbingly, what other aspects of the conflict might be proceeding according to American logic that Japanese thinking couldn't encompass? 3 months after Admiral Kenji's final journal entry questioning Japanese strategic assumptions, word reached Rabaul that Emperor Hirohito had announced Japan's surrender. The radio message arrived during the afternoon shift change, when the bunker's corridors filled briefly with men moving between duty stations that no longer served any purpose beyond maintaining routines that had become psychologically necessary. Lieutenant Commander Sato received the transmission with the same mechanical efficiency he had applied to all communications during the past year, but his hands trembled as he transcribed the formal language announcing the end of hostilities. The words seemed to carry more weight than their literal meaning. They represented not just military defeat, but the final confirmation that the war they had prepared to fight had never actually occurred. Kenji gathered his senior staff in the main briefing room for the last time. The maps that covered every surface, marked with defensive positions that had never been tested and supply routes that had never been interrupted, seemed like archaeological artifacts from a vanished civilization. Red pins still marked Japanese strongholds across the Pacific, most of them intact, all of them irrelevant to the war's outcome. "Gentlemen," Kenji began, then stopped, uncertain how to address officers who had served with distinction in a conflict that had passed them by entirely. "The Emperor has spoken. The war is over." Colonel Tanaka, whose drinking had progressed from evening ritual to daily necessity, stared at the sake cup in his hands as if it contained the meaning that military service had failed to provide. Did we even participate?" he asked, his voice carrying bewilderment rather than bitterness. "Were we soldiers in this war, or just observers?" The question hung in the air like smoke from incense offerings to ancestors who might have understood the honorable path through circumstances that defied traditional concepts of honor. They had maintained perfect readiness, followed orders flawlessly, demonstrated courage and dedication throughout their assignment. Yet history would record their contribution as a footnote if it mentioned them at all. Major Hayashi, still obsessed with calculations, provided figures that seemed to summarize their entire experience. "We consumed 847 tons of food, 2,341 tons of ammunition in training exercises, and 15,847 gallons of fuel, maintaining operational readiness for battles that were never fought. Our garrison was combat effective for 387 days without engaging a single enemy unit." The numbers represented perfect military efficiency applied to strategically meaningless objectives, a kind of mathematical proof that competence alone couldn't guarantee relevance. They had been superb soldiers in a war that didn't require their particular kind of excellence. American occupation forces arrived 6 weeks later, transported by the same ships that had bypassed Rabaul's defenses for over a year. The irony wasn't lost on Japanese personnel who watched landing craft approach beaches they had spent months preparing to defend. The Americans came not as conquerors, but as administrators, tasked with dismantling installations that had never threatened their advance. Captain Williams, the American officer assigned to oversee Rabaul's transition, spoke fluent Japanese and carried himself with the professional courtesy of someone who understood that his counterparts had served honorably within the limits of their strategic situation. During his first meeting with Kenji, he addressed questions that had tormented the Japanese garrison for months. "Your fortress was perfectly designed," Williams said, studying architectural plans that Japanese engineers had considered masterpieces of defensive engineering, "against the kind of attack we might have launched in 1943. But warfare evolved. Speed became more important than strength, mobility more valuable than position." The explanation provided intellectual understanding without emotional resolution. Knowing why they had been bypassed didn't diminish the psychological impact of irrelevance, didn't restore meaning to months of perfect preparation for battles that had never materialized. Dismantling Rabaul's fortifications required more time than the Americans had needed to capture and develop half a dozen strategic positions elsewhere. Concrete that had been poured to last decades required explosives and heavy equipment to remove. Underground tunnels that could have sheltered thousands during bombardment became storage spaces for equipment nobody needed. Gun emplacements that could have sunk battleships were transformed into foundations for peaceful construction projects. The symbolic weight of destruction hurt more than defeat might have. Seeing their life's work reduced to rubble by their former enemies carried a peculiar kind of pain. The recognition that their best efforts had been applied to objectives that history had rendered meaningless. Kenji's personal reckoning came during the dismantling process as he watched American work crews systematically destroying installations that represented years of Japanese labor and millions of yen in materials. The Americans worked efficiently, without malice or celebration, treating the fortifications as obstacles to be cleared rather than monuments to be conquered. Even in defeat, the Japanese garrison was denied the dignity of being considered a worthy opponent. Letters from home brought news of a Japan struggling to understand its place in a world where American strategic thinking had proven superior to traditional concepts of military strength. Cities destroyed by bombing campaigns conducted from bases that had been constructed using the island-hopping strategy that had bypassed places like Rabaul. Industrial infrastructure crippled by supply shortages caused by the same naval mobility that had made Japanese fortress strategy irrelevant. The personal cost of strategic irrelevance became clear as garrison members prepared for repatriation. Many found themselves struggling to explain their wartime experience to families that expected either heroic battle stories or noble sacrifice narratives. What could they say about months spent maintaining perfect readiness for battles that never came, about serving with distinction in a conflict that had proceeded without them? Lieutenant Commander Sato, who had maintained meticulous intelligence records throughout the war, discovered that his careful documentation had become historically valuable precisely because it recorded the experience of irrelevance. Scholars would later study his reports not for insights into successful defense strategies, but as examples of how quickly military thinking could become obsolete. The psychological adaptation required years. Men who had dedicated their lives to military excellence found themselves questioning not just their strategic assumptions, but their understanding of what constituted meaningful service. Some, like Colonel Tanaka, never fully recovered from the discovery that perfect preparation could accomplish nothing if applied to the wrong objectives. Others, including Major Hayashi, channeled their analytical skills into civilian careers that valued precision and dedication without requiring strategic brilliance.
Kenji himself returned to Hiroshima to find a city transformed by atomic destruction, and his wife Akiko tending a garden where their home had stood. The physical devastation was overwhelming, but it was also comprehensible in ways that strategic irrelevance had never been. Here was destruction that could be measured, mourned, and eventually overcome through reconstruction efforts. The bomb had been terrible, but direct, a form of warfare that Japanese thinking could understand and eventually respond to. "Did you fight well?" Akiko asked during one of their evening walks through the city's ruins. The question was both simple and impossible to answer. He had served faithfully, maintained discipline, demonstrated all the military virtues that generations of training had instilled. But the fight he had prepared for had never occurred. "I prepared well," he answered finally. "Whether that constituted fighting, I'm no longer certain." 5 years after Japan's surrender, Admiral Kenji, now a civilian working for a shipping company that helped rebuild Japan's merchant marine, received an invitation to attend a symposium on Pacific War strategy being held at Tokyo University. American and Japanese military historians had organized the conference to examine lessons learned from the conflict, with particular attention to innovations in strategic thinking that had shaped the war's outcome. Kenji almost declined the invitation. The prospect of dissecting his wartime experience in academic terms felt like volunteering for surgery without anesthesia. But curiosity overcame reluctance, and he found himself sitting in a lecture hall, listening to American officers explain the strategic logic that had made his fortress irrelevant. Captain Williams, the same officer who had overseen Rabaul's dismantling, presented the American perspective with charts and maps that revealed the island-hopping strategy's sophisticated planning. "Traditional warfare assumes that strength must be met with strength," he explained to an audience that included several of Kenji's former subordinates. "We decided to test whether strength could simply be ignored if mobility and logistics were managed efficiently." The presentation revealed calculations that Japanese planners had never considered. American strategists had analyzed the cost of taking every Japanese stronghold versus the cost of bypassing positions that didn't serve essential purposes. The mathematics were stark. Reducing Rabaul would have required months of bombardment, thousands of casualties, and enormous expenditure of resources. Ignoring it cost nothing while achieving the same strategic objective. "The goal was never to defeat Japanese forces in every location," Williams continued. "The goal was to advance toward Japan as efficiently as possible. Every battle that could be avoided represented resources saved for battles that couldn't be avoided." Dr. Yamashita, a Japanese historian who had interviewed hundreds of bypassed garrison veterans, provided context for the psychological impact of the strategy. "American planners may not have intended it, but their approach created a form of warfare that challenged fundamental assumptions about military service, honor, and meaningful sacrifice." Kenji listened as the academics dissected his deepest trauma with clinical precision. When the session ended, he approached Williams privately. "Did you know what you were doing to us?" The American considered carefully before answering. "We knew we were changing warfare forever. We didn't fully understand we were changing what it meant to be a warrior." Outside, Tokyo's rebuilt skyline stretched toward horizons that had once seemed impossibly distant. Kenji walked through streets that bustled with civilian purpose, finally understanding that some victories required abandoning everything you thought victory meant.